Howdy folks. Let's talk a little bit about DOM and the DOM manipulation. So the DOM is something that's only available in JavaScript in the browser. Once we get server-side JavaScript, you're not going to have access to that anymore. There's going to be a different set of APIs that you can access. The DOM is kind of considered an API. It's basically how JavaScript communicates with the browser, with all of the tags and CSS and such that you build. So let's start off by creating ourselves a page. Let's create ourselves a section. Let's put some content in it. All right, and now let's put a script. So there's two major things that you want to do in the DOM. The first is going to be actually getting kind of a handle for the element. So we have this section here. All right, you can see that here. If I inspect it, you can see this here. But how do we access this in JavaScript? Because it's all well and nice to have this on the page, but if we want to actually do something with this, we need to be able to grab it and kind of grab a reference to it, is what we call it, so that we can actually manipulate that in JavaScript. Well, there's a couple ways of doing that. JavaScript has a couple methods for this, so let's try let's put some classes. Let's make a couple more. Class equals section. Oops. 2 section 3. So if I have these three sections here, one of them by tag, one of them by class, one of them by ID. The first thing we can do is section 1 equals, so document is something that we always have access to in the DOM. in anywhere, any script you have, it's considered top level. It's actually a reference to window.document, but we use document so often that the browser just makes it available to us all the time. So one of the methods that we would use on this is get elements by tag name. And excuse me. And one of the reasons this might be useful is if you wanted to get all of your sections, for instance. So if I put in a tag name, and actually let's just say sections tag. And then if I'm going to, remember for debug, you can always console log sections by tag. And then I run this. You can see something interesting here. First of all, we have all three of our sections. So if I mouse over them here, any time you have an element in the console, you can mouse over it and see where on the page it exists, if it still exists, which is kind of useful. And so you can see this is an HTML collection. It's kind of like an array. You can kind of treat it like an array. So if I wanted to get the 0th of this by tag, I can say 0 on it. And then you see it prints that one. I can get the length of it, which is 3. And so it behaves sort of like an array in that case. But you notice also it has this my section. So if I do that, it's also an object. So it kind of behaves like an array and like an object, which all arrays in JavaScript are objects. This is just a different property on it. If you were looping through this array, you'd only get these first 3. You wouldn't get this last one. But if you also want to get a tag by its ID, you can do that here. So that's kind of useful if you want to get all sections. So if I wanted to do something with all of these, I could do that. The other way you can do this is by class. And so document dot get elements, and you notice these are elements, plural. Even if there's one element that matches the class, it'll still return us an array because there could be more, and that's just what it does. So this one takes in a class. This is actually kind of confusing. Let's do this. This takes a class name without the dot. So I'm just going to put, actually I'm going to change this to my class just so that's less confusing. My class in here. And when I run this, oops, I didn't print it. you can see it's still an HTML collection, but now it only has this one particular entry, and that's because this entry is the only one that has that class. If there was another one, my class, that had that on it, then it would get two. It would get both of them. The third method for this is section document.getElement by ID. And you notice this is not elements. This is element. And that's because there should only ever be one element on the page with that ID. So I put in my ID in here. You can see that corresponds to the ID here. Long section by ID. And you notice that does not return an HTML collection. That just returns just straight up the element. If I change this, accidentally put a typo, maybe that doesn't exist, it returns null. So those are three of the common ways of accessing elements. So each one of these now, these are two lists, but this one is an element, and on these elements we can manipulate them. We can do things. We can get their values. We can get their HTMLs. We can check their styles. We can check their attributes. Essentially, this is kind of our JavaScript link to this HTML here. So this is the same thing as here. It's just in JavaScript and we can manipulate it now. There is a final one, and that is document.query selector. So there's actually two here. There's query selector and query selector all. The main difference is that query selector will always return the first response. So if I actually put in a tag here, and bear in mind, this is now a CSS selector. So this tag here, this is just like if you did in CSS style. This is a valid selector because it's a tag. I can put that tag here. I can also put my section. I can also put my class. I could also put section, or if I wanted to do a compound selector, body section. I mean, that's going to be the same thing here, but anything that's a valid CSS selector can go in here. Now, if I log this, sections by selector, you see we only get one, even though it's a tag and there should be more than one. If I run query selector all, then you can see this is not an HTML content list. So if we log sections by tag, this is an HTML collection. This is a node list, so they're a little different. HTML collection, you can see it has this ID here for the element that had an ID. The node list does not have that. It just has these three elements in here. So generally, if you're treating these like arrays, there's not going to be that much of a difference. You can loop over both of them. You can index both of them. You can handle them exactly the same. But just bear in mind that one of them has this little extra parameter in here for any IDs, and the other one does not. If we did my section on query selector all, you can see it's still a node list. It just happens to have that one thing. But then if I do it with query selector, it's going to be that single element. So now that we have these, what do we do with them? Well, the first thing that we might want to do is we might want to set their content. So if I want to change the content of every single one of these to something, I can loop, standard for loop, sections by tag dot length, because length is a thing we can do. Element equals sections by tag I, and let's console log that element, just so we can see what that's about. So now when I run that, let's actually take this console log out, just to clear things up. You can see I now have my individual, the loop has run it, showing each individual little element here. So let's say we want to change our content. Well, the first thing we can do is get the content, old content element.text content. And what that's going to do is that's going to get you whatever text is inside here. So if we console log that, you can see content, content2, content3. You notice also there's that tab here, that's because this is indented. If I unindent content 2, you can see now that doesn't happen. JavaScript doesn't generally care about white space for display, but for actually getting the content, it will consider that. There's also a new line in there, so if I do this, you notice that's different. This one actually has kind of that invisible new line in here in those tabs. Not the biggest deal, but just something to bear in mind. So if we want to set the content, just like setting a property on an object, new content plus I, and now you can see it's changed in here. So this was the old content of it. Now I've changed it to new content dynamically. So that's useful in a lot of cases. In a lot of cases, you're going to want to update something. Like, for example, let's say you have, well, we'll get into that later. But if you have someone's name and you want to like greet them, maybe you have some span in here that has an ID, and as soon as they put in their name, you update that span with hello, comma, name. So it's just a way for JavaScript to be able to dynamically update this content of the web page whenever it wants to. So, what's another thing we can do? We can access attributes. So if I want to get access to the ID, log element.at attributes. And so let's just see what's in there. You can see these are named node map. So this is not an object. It's not a map. It's a named node map, which has it's basically an array of all the attributes, but also the properties. So if I grab ID on here, you can see it shows my section. Of course, that's actually that entire attribute list, which isn't super useful. So let me actually look this up because I don't remember. JS get attribute. Get attribute. Okay, so you can see element.get attribute. So we can get the data here, but if we call get attribute on it, I have to pass in the attribute name, ID. And you can see these two are null because they don't have an ID, but this one is my section, and that's something we could use. You can also set attribute. So if I run here, element.set attribute, ID, section, and then I'm going to add the I in there. I run through that, and if I go to my elements, you can see they've now had this ID added to them, and this one has had the ID changed. And then at that point, if I really want to, I can even use get selector section by ID on one of those new IDs, and it will work. It will get this new one, even though it didn't exist in the beginning. So JavaScript and these objects are very dynamic. As the web page changes, what they can do also changes. So they'll be able to adapt to these new attributes. There's a couple of special attributes, classes. I can get and set class as well. So if I set class like this, you can see now it sets the class to that. And that's fine, but sometimes you want more than one class. So let's say I want to keep my class around just on this object. I can actually, instead of doing set attribute, I can use class list. And class list has, I believe it's append. So let's try that. Section, it might be something else. Nope, it's not append. It doesn't like that. Add. And also spell class or list right. Okay. So now you can see this has this class, this has this class. This now has the new class, but also has the old class. So that's how you would use that if you just want to manipulate the class list without changing what's already there. Like maybe you don't want to undo the whole thing. Likewise, you can remove a class in the same way. So if I do this, you can see it's added, but then it immediately gets removed. So it just it leaves this empty attribute behind but there's no value in it. So classes are a little bit of a special attribute that you can access. The other one that's a little special is data attributes. So if we have a data dash foo, for instance, you can, this is very common for if you want to put metadata on your section or on your tags for whatever reason. So if I want, I can actually go here and I can say element.get, let's console log it, element.get attribute data dash foo. And let's kill this. And so what that's going to give me is bar, because this is bar, and then null because it doesn't exist on the second two. However, there's another way of doing that. I can also say element dot dataset. And if I look at the dataset is a DOM string map, which is a completely different thing from an object for some reason. But you can see it has that foo in there also. So I can also do this. I can also set it, element.dataset dot param equals thing. And if I look at my elements now, you can see they now have data dash param. So if you do anything on here in this data set, it's going to automatically look for the data dash. And if you're setting it, it adds that automatically. If you're getting it, it just looks for it automatically. So that's kind of a nice thing. People use data parameters a lot, or data attributes a lot. And so the DOM just has a nifty way of just accessing that. The final thing that you can do that is kind of a little interesting is you can do inline styles. So we've done inline styles a little bit. So if I say style equals color red, this is a standard CSS style, right? But it only applies to that element, and it's in specificity, it's the most specific, so it's really hard to override it. You can also access that via the DOM. So let's log element.getAttribute style is a thing you can do. So you can see that color red. That's not super handy because that's just a string. So the other thing you can do is there's actually just a style object. So if you say element.style, now you can see this becomes a CSS style declaration, which has pretty much every single thing you can put on it. These are all defaults right now. This is the one, you can see it has that color on it. And if I go down, if I can find color in here, it's got that red. So you could also say style.color, and that will just print out red, but it'll also print out blank. It's not null, because CSS rules don't really get to be null, but it's blank for the other two. You can also set it. Element.style.color equals blue. And you can see they all became blue now, and it added in that style automatically for them. If you're doing something like max width, if you do it like this, JavaScript gets confused because it's saying what is max minus width. So you can index it like this. Let's actually do 10. Actually, 10 pixels. Then you can see max width 10 pixels. The other thing you can do is if you use camel case, like this, JavaScript or the DOM knows that that means that it should be a dash and a lowercase there. Important thing, you notice if I just do 10 here for this sizing, it doesn't show up. If you pass an invalid value into a style parameter, it just won't set it. 10 is not valid because it doesn't have a unit on it. So I have to say 10 pixels specifically, and then it'll show up. So that's kind of how you deal with style, text content, class list, data set, etc. That is most of what you want to do in the DOM. There's one additional thing that you might want, and that's creating elements. So let's say I want to, well, let's just do it in here. Let's say I want to create a new element in here. I'm actually going to set this to 150 because that looks a little silly. There we go. So if I want to create a new element dynamically, meaning that like maybe I want to put something here, there's a number of reasons why you want to do this. But there's a lot of reasons why you would want the DOM to be manipulatable dynamically. You can say new element equals document, because remember, anytime we're doing something with the DOM and we want a reference to it, we gotta use a document. Create element. And then the parameter here is the tag. So let's say I want to create a div. Okay. So I go through, I'm going to console log this div. Oops. New element. Run this. Okay, I see the div. Notice when I mouse over it though, nothing happens. And that's because it's not on the page. I created this element and I never did anything with it. So in order to do something with it, you actually have to append it as a child of another element. So you could append it to the body. Let's actually give it some text content. Just like all these other ones, any of these other things apply here. So I can say text content equals new div plus I. And now if you see I run that, it actually has this new div inside of it, but it's still not on the page. I can append these anywhere, so I can say body. Whoops. What is it? There's a document.body, I think. Yeah. Which is going to be this body tag. Append child, new element. And now you can see this has now been added to the DOM, and if I mouse over them, it shows up here. You can also append them to another element. So let's say I've got my section by ID here, or actually I've got my element here. I can call element.append child, and now you can see those divs all got appended into the sections. Each section now has its own div. There's also ways you can move existing content. So for example, if I say section by class 0.append child, which should be this content 1, and I append the section by ID, then I look at this, where is it? This is also set up now. Sections by class now has this section underneath it. And so this section, if you append child on something that's already on the DOM, it's already on the page, it actually moves it from where it was. So it takes it out of its current parent and moves it to the new parent, which can be useful in some cases if you want to preserve stuff. Yeah, so that's basically the DOM and how to work with it. It's not super complicated at its heart. It's just kind of figuring out how all this stuff fits together. There's also a bunch of other attributes and APIs that are provided, like the alert is actually a DOM element or a DOM API. Set timeout and set interval are as well. There's a couple of other things like parseInt, but those are not necessarily about HTML manipulation, so I'm not going to go over them today. I hope this is useful, and I'll see you all in class.